Hello, AP US History class. This is Mr. Shalou. I want to finish Chapter 25 on World War II. This will be the last section of our discussion. And then after this, we will start review for our AP exam that's supposedly coming up. I don't know. We'll see what happens. Last time we left off looking at the war in Europe. That was the main focal point of the Allies. Today we're going to be looking at the Pacific War. So something completely different on the other side of the world in a much different strategy than what you saw in Europe against Hitler and the Nazi regime. War in the Pacific had two main goals: regain the Philippines that were lost in the first days after Pearl Harbor, and then also to invade the main islands of Japan. So Japan proved to be a very bitter enemy. They fought to the very end. Unlike the Germans in Europe, the Japanese culture did not believe in surrender. So there was nothing short of total victory that would be required in the Pacific in order to defeat the Japanese. This is going to lead to a pretty brutal strategy, a pretty awful fighting and conflict that, I mean, you did have that similar situation in the European theater, but you can definitely tell the difference between the fighting in the Pacific and the fighting in Europe simply by how tenacious the Japanese fighting groups were. The strategy that the United States is going to use is island hopping. So the Japanese try to secure all of the main islands in the Pacific. They figured that the Americans were coming back to strike at them. So America had to decide which islands it was going to conquer and which it was going to kind of leave by the wayside, which was not strategically important. And the reason that America does this is because they don't want to attack the Japanese at full force. They want to keep the Japanese on their toes. It's a way of stepping stones back to the islands of Japan. It's going to be incredibly effective. The islands that the United States are going to target are going to be strategically important to the United States, but they're not necessarily what the Japanese feel would be the islands that America is going to concentrate its forces on. So essentially, there were three steps to the island hopping campaign. First, the Americans would shell an island with its artillery through either naval bombardment on ships or through like aircraft. Then there would be landed troops engaging in hand-to-hand. Troops would land under very heavy gunfire. Then the troops would engage in hand-to-hand combat, suffering pretty heavy losses. It is here in the Pacific War where the Navajo code talkers, which we talked about in class before we left off, they were used to send radio messages from ship to ship, island to island, because the Japanese were never able to break this code. They didn't know the Navajo language. It was completely unfamiliar, and it was unbreakable for the Japanese throughout the course of World War II. So an effective strategy for the Americans in using the Native American language of the Navajo. General MacArthur is going to be the governor at the beginning of the war for the Philippines. He's ousted in the early days of the war by the Japanese. He's going to return to the Philippines, help the Americans capture not only the Philippines, but also Iwo Jima and Okinawa as well. These are the two closest islands to the mainland of the Japanese archipelago. At this point, the Japanese are going to get pretty brutal. Like I said before, that they do not surrender. So they use a strategy called kamikaze, which in translation means the divine wind. So Japanese pilots would intentionally crash their planes into U.S. ships. This caused some pretty significant damage. It was essentially a suicide mission. They understood that it was a suicide mission, and still about 5,000 kamikaze attacks are going to take place on American ships throughout the course of the war. As you can see from this map, you have a very large area that we're talking about. This is greater than the size of the United States, just to give you a little bit of a comparison. It's really tremendous amount of territory that the Japanese are going to extend out into. And for America to choose which islands it's going to use as part of its island hopping campaign, you can see there's a lot of options. And so the way that America is going to slowly creep Japan back into its home islands is it's a slow process, but it is an effective process. And I shouldn't fail to neglect to say that while the European War is being fought, it's not as if the Pacific War was on pause. This is still fighting that is taking place. It's just a majority of the resources devoted to the war are going to be focused attention on Europe first, and then the Pacific, but you still have pretty intense fighting that is going to take place in the Pacific. I already mentioned the kamikaze suicide bombers. So by April of 1945, American forces had gotten close to Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and they were very close to attacking the main islands of Japan. To prepare, American bombers started pounding Japanese factories, and the ships started bombarding the coastline. There were pretty heavy casualties amongst not only the Japanese military, but also the civilian population as well. Even still, the Japanese refused to surrender, even though it looked pretty obvious that the United States would win this conflict. So after the fall of Germany in Europe, with all of the attention now focused on the Pacific, a land invasion, kind of in a similar vein to D-Day, started to be implemented. It was planned that this attack would take place somewhere in fall of 1945, but the expected casualties were anywhere from like 250,000 American lives to over 1 million if this land invasion were to actually take place. So on a massive scale, much bigger than what you would have ever seen at the D-Day invasion in 1944. So America, while trying to create this plan for an invasion, realized that this was going to be a sobering moment for the United States military, that victory was going to be at a cost of millions, or thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of American lives. So before this plan is implemented, there is a final kind of meeting between the Allied powers. You have the Winston Churchill of Britain, you have Stalin of the Soviet Union, and now you have Truman of the United States that are going to meet in Potsdam they're going to come up with a strategy for how best to defeat the Japanese. The Allies had a secret weapon at their disposal. They warned Japan that they would either had to surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. Truman introduced to his Allied colleagues the Manhattan Project. Manhattan Project was the development of the atomic bomb. Japan kind of ignored this warning, thinking that it was probably a stall tactic or it was a bluff, not realizing exactly what this project was. It's not like the Allies came out and said, hey, we have an atomic bomb. Even though you have never seen one before, you have no idea of its capabilities, we're going to destroy your country if you do not surrender. Well, there were 3 bombs that were created from this Manhattan Project. The first was used as a test, and the test ended up being even more destructive than anybody could have imagined. That one bomb could level an entire city. And so that after that test, the first bomb was loaded up into the Enola Gay. It was dropped on August 6th, 1945. Hiroshima is a industrial center within Japan, destroying most of the city, killing at least 70,000 instantaneously, killing another 100,000 plus over the years as a result of the radiation exposure, causing massive destruction on a scale never seen before in human history. Despite the carnage that this first atomic bomb created, no response by the Japanese. They went dark, silent. So 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped over Nagasaki, another industrial center. Only 40,000, still a pretty dramatic, massive number, but 40,000 were killed, double for the amount of radiation exposure that led to cancer and death down the line. So it's not something to take seriously. These were absolutely horrific events that took place. Many more cities were targeted, essentially. It was these specific cities were the ending up decisions, mainly because of their strategic importance to the war effort. But at the same time, America was not really thinking of the impact that this would have on civilian casualties. It was known, but it wasn't really to the at least the moral standards. It was not really discussed. I guess the rationale must have been that in times of war, people are willing to take dramatic action in order to kind of sustain or at least protect American troops. This was the alternative to a land invasion that would have cost anywhere from 250,000 to 1 million American lives. So after the second bomb at Nagasaki was dropped, by August 14th, Japan had officially surrendered, which is known as Victory in Japan Day. And the official formal ceremony is going to take place in the following month in September of 1945 on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The war officially comes to an end. It's probably common knowledge, but in case you're not aware, these were the only 2 atomic bombs that have ever been dropped in a war situation. They have the only 2 attacks that have led to the loss of human life. After these 2, it was pretty apparent that use of nuclear weapons would only be in the most dramatic, serious of circumstances. And luckily, knock on wood, we have not had to experience something on this level since the end of World War II. These are the 2 bombs. You have Little Boy and Fat Man. Fat Man is the one that was dropped in Hiroshima. Little Boy was dropped for Nagasaki. And there is the ship, the airplane, the Enola Gay, that is going to transport the Hiroshima bomb. I might be saying that wrong. It might be Hiroshima. It depends on how Mrs. Canick would say it. I've always learned it as Hiroshima, but I'm old. So 48,000 buildings, 70,000 people killed instantaneously. Hundreds of thousands are going to die of radiation poisoning, cancer at a later date. You can see in this pretty graphic photograph, the clothes literally burned, singed onto this individual's body. That's how severe this instantaneous attack was going to be. Another graphic photograph here within Nagasaki, 60,000 injured, 40,000 killed immediately. Hundreds of thousands are going to die once again of radiation poisoning, cancer later Victory in Japan Day. You have a famous photograph here back in the United States of sailors going around kissing ladies, knowing that the end of the war probably wouldn't fly too well today, but at the time it was seen as a romantic gesture. Yeah. This is the deadliest war in human history. And I feel like I'm repeating myself because that was similar to what you saw with the end of World War One. This was much more catastrophic than what you saw in World War One. Although, if you would combine the deaths related to Spanish influenza, they're pretty close to being on par. But you still see um, World War II as the most deadly conflict. Anywhere from 30 to 60 million people are going to die worldwide as a direct result of the conflict related to fighting. That is going to include both civilian population as well as people directly fighting. And this does not take into account the Holocaust that was also going on at the same times. And we will talk about the Holocaust tomorrow or at some other point later this week. Much of Europe, Asia are going to be physically destroyed by the bombing that took place. Housing, roads, infrastructure, bridges, railroads, factories, farms, pretty much all of Western Europe, much of Germany, much of the Japanese islands were completely destroyed by the conflict. Millions are going to be left homeless, out of work after the war. America is also learning about the brutal treatment of prisoners of war, mainly in the Pacific Theater. You did have a little bit less of the inhumane treatment of POWs in Germany, although then once the horrors of the Holocaust were discovered, that would be another situation of prisoners of war, and that was pretty catastrophic as well. So you have a infographic here showing you the levels of death that each country experienced by the war. At the end, you have two superpowers that are going to emerge. The United States, even though we focused mainly on the U.S. in this conflict, you cannot underestimate the importance of the Soviet Union in sustaining the war for the years that America was mainly focusing on North Africa and Italy, and really the years that America was not involved in the war as well. The Soviet Union is going to face a pretty significant price for fighting in this war. The estimate that I believe is the most accurate is about 17 million Soviets are going to be killed in this fighting, and that's very similar to what you saw in World War One as well. The Japanese are going to be there's going to be a number of war crime trials that are going to be held for Hideki Tojo, for the biological experiments that were being conducted. You also have the Nuremberg trials that are going to take place in Europe for the Nazi exposure to the Holocaust. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about the Holocaust later this week. So just a very brief overview. It was not until the final months of the war that the Allies uncovered the reality of what was going on. There were hints, and there was always the rumors of what the level of the concentration camps were being held. I mean, it was known that the German population was doing something with the Jewish population. But it really was not the extent to what was happening. The extermination camps were not uncovered until the very end of the war when the Allies pushed into German territory. Over 12 million victims were killed during the Holocaust. 6 million were Jews, And then you have another 6 million that are going to be Polish, Slavic gypsies, which are wanderers, Romani is the official term. Prisoners of war were and mainly with the Soviet Union on that side. Americans and British were much better treated, mainly because the British in the United States were better treating German prisoners of war. So there was kind of a mutual agreement. However, the Soviets were devastated by the Germans. There was a really bitter hatred between the two sides. Um, 12 million were starved, tortured, slaughtered. The two largest concentration camps were Auschwitz and Dachau. And these camps contained gas chambers, crematoriums, and other like experiments. Biological experiments were also uncovered, and it's pretty graphic, pretty gruesome. The level of inhumanity that took place. The Jewish population in Europe is going to shrink from 9 million to about 3 million, less than 3 million by the end of the war. Nazis had sent many of their undesirables in society to these extermination camps, hoping to get rid of these groups from Europe forever. And then after the war, the Nuremberg trials were held. Only 12 Nazis were actually sentenced to death. Thousands more that participated in the Holocaust and the war itself were imprisoned. Many others, though, had escaped to places. The most well-known was Adolf Eichmann, who was one of the inner circle of Hitler. He was able to escape to Argentina. And a lot of former Nazis escaped to Latin America, South America, to escape the prosecution during the Nuremberg trials. Pretty graphic. I'm going to stop, and pretty depressing place to stop. Like I said, later this week we will talk about the impact of the Holocaust, and then really the impact of the end of the war. Because as one war comes to an end, the victory over the Germans and the Axis powers in general, a new war started almost instantaneously between the United States and the Soviet Union. In the months leading up to the end of the war, it became apparent that the Allies could not cooperate. They had very different visions for the future of not only Europe but the rest of the world, and that's going to contribute to the much longer, much more impactful warfare, the Cold War. And we'll talk about that later this week. Thank you very much for listening. As always, if you have any questions, please email or leave a comment. Thank you very much. Have a good day.